The combat arena on Station Vex 7 hummed with energy shields and the murmur of dozens of alien voices speaking in their native tongues. Through translator devices clipped to their uniforms or embedded in their bodies depending on species requirements and preferences for technology integration with biological systems, Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the fighting ring and rolled her shoulders to loosen the tight muscles that had knotted during the long wait for her turn in the trial sequence. That would determine whether she could continue in the combat track of the Galactic Military Academy or be reassigned to support roles that humans had traditionally filled since joining the Coalition 3 years prior to this moment. Her opponent waited on the opposite side of the circular platform, and his name was Catharin of the Star species, who stood nearly 8 feet tall with scales that gleamed like polished obsidian under the artificial lighting systems and muscles that rippled beneath natural armor plating that had evolved over millions of years on a high-gravity world, where only the strongest survived to reproduce and pass on their superior genetics. Around the ring sat 5 instructors at an elevated observation deck, and they represented different species from across the Coalition, including a 4-armed Krill veteran named Ormesh, who served as senior combat instructor and had seen action in the border wars 2 decades ago, when the Coalition had last faced serious external threats to their unified government structure. Among the crowd of watching recruits stood Vexenal, who was a centauri with golden skin and 3 eyes, arranged in a triangle pattern on his face, and he held a datapad that supposedly contained evaluation criteria, though he had barely glanced at it, because everyone knew what happened when humans faced Scar in physical combat trials, and the outcome was never favorable for the smaller and weaker species from Earth. The trial administrator activated the arena with a gesture, and the energy barriers flared to life with a blue-white glow that would contain the combat and prevent injuries to spectators while still allowing clear observation of all techniques and movements executed by both participants during the evaluation period. Combatants ready, the administrator announced through the translation network. Thuron dropped into a fighting stance that his people had perfected over centuries of gladiatorial tradition, and his claws extended from fingertips with a clicking sound that echoed in the suddenly quiet arena, where even the chattering recruits had fallen silent to watch what they expected to be a quick and decisive demonstration of star superiority. Sarah took a breath and centered herself with techniques she had learned from too many martial arts dojos and boxing gyms back on Earth, where humans still practiced combat sports, even though they no longer needed those skills for survival in their modern civilization that had eliminated most physical violence through social development and technological advancement. The administrator Saad Thuron launched forward with speed that seemed impossible for something so large, and his first strike came in a sweeping claw attack aimed at Sarah's head that would have ended the match immediately if it had connected with full force against her unarmored flesh. Sarah ducked and felt the wind of his claws passing over her hair, and she pivoted to create distance, but Catharin was already following up with a low kick that caught her in the ribs and sent her stumbling backward toward the energy barrier that crackled with warning proximity alerts. She caught her balance and raised her guard, but Catharin pressed the advantage with a combination of strikes that forced Sarah to defend desperately, and she blocked what she could and absorbed what she couldn't avoid, and each impact sent shockwaves through her arms and body that promised spectacular bruising within the next few hours. The watching recruits murmured among themselves, and most of them had already written off the humans' chances, because this pattern was familiar from previous trials where humans had attempted combat certification and failed against physically superior opponents from warrior species, like the Star or the Vronax or the battle-bred Kellerctherin. Grabbed Sarah by her uniform and lifted her off the ground with one hand, and then threw her across the ring, where she hit hard and rolled and tried to get to her feet, but he was already there. His tail swept her legs, and she went down again. This continued for what felt like an eternity, too. Sarah, but the timer showed only 6 minutes, had elapsed, and Catharin dominated every exchange with his superior reach and strength and natural weapons that humans simply could not match without technological augmentation that was forbidden in these trials. Vexenal watched with barely concealed satisfaction because he had argued against allowing humans into combat roles and insisted they were Better suited for diplomatic positions or technical support were their clever minds, could contribute without risking their fragile bodies in situations they were evolutionarily unprepared to handle. At the 9-minute mark, Catharon managed to get Sarah into a submission hold with his arm wrapped around her neck and his superior strength, making escape impossible through technique alone. And Sarah struggled for several seconds before her hand tapped rapidly against his scaled forearm in the universal signal of surrender. Catharon released her immediately and stepped back with the honorable conduct expected of Star Warriors who prided themselves on fighting with dignity and respect for worthy opponents, even when those opponents were clearly outmatched in every measurable category. Sarah rolled to her knees and coughed and tried to catch her breath while Catharon stood calmly and waited for the instructors to call the match and award him victory in what had been a predictable outcome from the moment the pairings were announced. Vexenal approached the ring with his datapad, and his 3 eyes gleamed with vindication as he prepared to document what everyone had witnessed and confirm what he had known all along about human limitations in combat situations. "Recruit Chen," he said with formal tone, though satisfaction dripped from every word, "you have failed the combat trial and will be removed from the combat track effective immediately and reassigned to duties more appropriate for your species. Capabilities and physical limitations." Sarah looked up at him from where she knelt, and her face was bruised, and swelling had already started around her left eye, and her breathing came hard and ragged, but something in her expression made Vexenal pause. He glanced toward the instructor platform, expecting to see them preparing the next match and processing the paperwork for Sarah's reassignment, but instead all 5 instructors remained perfectly still, and they were all watching Sarah with an intensity that seemed completely wrong for someone who had just failed and been eliminated. Instructor Warmesh leaned forward in his seat, and his forearms were crossed in a gesture that Vexenal had learned to recognize as deep concentration and evaluation rather than casual observation. The other instructors showed similar focus, and their various alien features were arranged in expressions that translated roughly to anticipation or perhaps curiosity, but definitely not the boredom or disappointment that should accompany a failed trial. Vexenal looked back at Sarah and then at Catharon, who had moved to the edge of the ring and was also watching with confusion evident in his body language. "The match is over," Catharon said to Sarah, with respect but also puzzlement. Sarah slowly stood up, and her legs shook slightly, but held her weight, and she wiped blood from her split lip and moved back into a ready stance with her hands raised and her feet positioned in the basic fighting posture they had all been taught.
"Oh."
"No," Sarah said quietly, but her voice carried in the silent arena, "You didn't kill me." Vexenal felt the first stirring of doubt, and his eyes flicked to his datapad, and he began scrolling through the trial parameters that he had only skimmed before because the outcome had seemed so obvious and predetermined. Vexenal's 3 eyes widened as he read the actual parameters of the trial, and his golden skin flushed darker with a mix of embarrassment and growing horror at the mistake he had just made in front of the entire recruit class and the senior instructors, who were still watching with that unnerving focus. This was not a sparring trial where victory went to the combatant who scored the most points or achieved submission holds or demonstrated superior technique in controlled exchanges meant to showcase skill without causing serious injury. This was a combat endurance trial, and the parameters clearly stated that participants must remain combat capable for the full 30-minute duration, regardless of how many times they were knocked down or submitted, or appeared to be losing by traditional scoring metrics. The goal was not to win exchanges, but to survive them and keep fighting, and continue to pose a threat to the opponent no matter how badly the individual moments went or how much damage accumulated. Over the course of the extended engagement, Vexel looked at the timer display, and his stomach dropped when he saw they were only 12 minutes into the trial, with 18 minutes still remaining before anyone could legitimately be declared failed or successful on the mat. Sarah had resumed her fighting stance despite the visible damage she had taken, and her left eye was swelling shut, and bruises were forming on her arms and ribs, and her breathing was labored, but she remained upright and ready. Thorin looked genuinely confused, and he glanced at the instructors for guidance, because in Scare culture, combat ended When one party submitted or was rendered unable to continue, and the idea of fighting after tapping out made no sense within his understanding of honorable combat, "I do not understand." Catharon said to Sarah, "You surrendered the hold." "I surrendered that position," Sarah replied, and her voice was rough but steady. "The fight continues," Instructor Warmash finally spoke, and his deep voice carried across the arena through the translation. "Network recruit Catherine. The trial continues until the time expires, or until your opponent is medically as exley unable to maintain combat readiness, and neither condition has been met." Catharin's scales rippled in a pattern that indicated surprise among his species, and he looked at Sarah with new assessment in his eyes, as if seeing her for the first time as something other than an inferior opponent to be quickly defeated. The other instructors were now actively monitoring their displays, and one of them was a Quellan named Instructor Srath, who had specialized medical training and was watching Sarah's biometric data with interest that bordered on fascination. "Her heart rate is elevated but steady," Srath said quietly too. "Warmesh, though," the comment was picked up by the translation network. "Oxygen saturation is compensating effectively, and look at the cellular repair activity in her damaged tissues." Warmesh nodded and pulled up the same data on his own display and saw what had caught his colleague's attention, because Sarah's body was already beginning to heal the damage from the first 12 minutes of combat. The bruises that had formed on her arms during the early exchanges were already transitioning from the dark purple of fresh impact trauma to the yellowish green of bruises. Several days old, and the split lip had stopped bleeding and was visibly knitting itself back together. This was something the Coalition medical researchers had noted about humans when they first joined, but seeing it in real time during active combat added new context to the dry scientific reports about accelerated healing factors and enhanced tissue repair mechanisms. Meanwhile, Catharin was breathing heavily, and his massive chest heaved with the effort of drawing enough oxygen to fuel his powerful muscles, and his species had evolved for burst combat, where fights lasted minutes at most before one party achieved decisive victory. They had incredible strength and natural armor, and reflexes that put most species to shame, but they had not evolved for extended engagements, because on their homeworld combat was about establishing dominance quickly and efficiently. Sarah moved, and Catharin reacted immediately with another powerful combination. But this time, Sarah didn't try to block or deflect, and instead, she moved backward and circled, and made him come to her, which forced him to cover more ground and expend more energy. The watching recruits began to murmur among themselves, and a few of the sharper ones were starting to understand what they were witnessing, though most still expected Catharon to eventually wear Sarah down and achieve the decisive victory that his species was bred for. Vexenal stood frozen with his datapad hanging loosely in his hands, and he watched his earlier confidence crumble as the trial continued. And Sarah kept standing and kept moving and kept presenting herself as a viable combat threat. Theron pressed forward again and landed several solid strikes that would have ended fights against most opponents, but Sarah absorbed them and rolled with them and used footwork to minimize their impact, and then she was moving again and creating distance at the 15-minute mark. Sarah's movements had settled into a rhythm, and she was no longer fighting frantically to survive, but instead fighting methodically to endure, and there was a difference between the two approaches that the experienced instructors recognized immediately. "She has found her pace," Warmesh said to the other instructors. "Watch how she manages her energy expenditure." Sarah wasn't trying to match Catharin's power, and she wasn't attempting techniques that required strength she didn't possess, and instead, she was fighting smart and fighting efficiently, and most importantly, she was fighting like she had all the time in the world. Thurin landed another heavy blow that sent Sarah stumbling, but she recovered quickly, and the instructors noted that her recovery time was actually improving rather than degrading as the fight continued, and her body was adapting to the stress and finding optimal responses. By the 18-minute mark, Catharin's attacks were noticeably slower, and his breathing had become labored to the point where he was taking several seconds between combinations to gather himself in his natural armor, which had seemed like such an advantage, was now trapping heat and making temperature regulation difficult. Sarah, meanwhile, with sweat pouring down her face and soaking her uniform, but the instructors knew that sweating was a human advantage. It's not a weakness because it allowed for efficient cooling. That kept muscles and organs functioning at optimal levels. One of the human recruits in the observation area whispered to another, "She's hunting him." And the comment spread through the small group of Earth natives who were beginning to understand. The strategy their fellow human was employing was a strategy as old as humanity itself, and it dated back to the African plains, where early humans had learned to pursue prey not by outrunning it in a sprint, but by following it relentlessly until the prey collapsed from exhaustion and Hitsura threw a jab that lacked the power to hurt Catherine, but forced him to react and raise his guard, and then she circled left and made him turn and follow and burning more of his dwindling energy reservist thoroughness. Frustration was becoming visible, and he had never encountered an opponent who simply refused to stay down and in. His experience fights ended when dominance was established, but Sarah seemed to have no concept of accepting dominance. She went down and got back up and went down again and got back up again, and each time she rose a little faster and moved a little more confidently, while Catherine grew more tired and more uncertain. At the 22-minute mark, Sarah landed her first truly effective strike, and it was a quick jab to Catherine's throat that made him cough and step back, and the watching crowd reacted with surprise. Up until that moment, Catherine had seemed invulnerable. Sarah pressed the momentary advantage with several more strikes, and none of them were powerful enough to cause serious damage, but they were precise, and they were accumulating, and they were forcing Catherine to defend rather than attack. The instructors exchanged glances, and Warmesh allowed himself a small smile, because this was exactly what the combat endurance trial was designed to test. And Sarah Chin was demonstrating why humans had earned their place in the coalition, despite their obvious physical disadvantages. Wasn't stronger than Catherine, and she wasn't faster, and she didn't have natural weapons or armor, but she had something that many warrior species had forgotten about in their focus on individual combat prowess. She had endurance, and she had the ability to suffer and continue, and she had the psychological makeup to ignore her body's demands to quit. The atmosphere in the arena had shifted completely from the confident expectation of Catherine's quick victory to something else entirely, and the recruits leaned forward in their seats and whispered urgently to each other as they tried to process what they were witnessing. Sarah moved around the ring with constant motion, and her feet never stopped shifting and adjusting, and she circled Catherine like a predator, except she was supposed to be the prey in this equation, and the reversal was becoming more obvious with each passing minute. Catherine attempted another powerful combination, but his movements were sluggish now, and his strikes lacked the snap and precision they had possessed at the beginning of the trial. And when Sarah slipped to the side and made him miss, he actually stumbled slightly from overextension. Watching instructors were now openly discussing what they were observing. An instructor, Srath, pulled up comparative data on multiple species and their combat endurance profiles, and the results were illuminating in ways that dry academic studies had never quite captured. "Look at the energy efficiency differential," Srath said, while highlighting graphs and metabolic readouts. Catherine has burned through 70% of his readily available glycogen stores, while Sarah is only at 45%, despite taking significantly more damage. Warmesh nodded and added his own observations to the discussion. Human bipedal locomotion is remarkably efficient, and their skeletal structure allows for movement that minimizes energy waste and maximizes endurance capacity over extended periods. Another instructor named Krell, who was a massive Vronax with gray skin like stone, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. How is she still standing after the punishment she absorbed in the first 15 minutes? Srath brought up Sarah's medical profile and began highlighting relevant sections. Humans have multiple redundant systems for managing pain and damage, and their endocrine system releases chemicals that suppress pain perception and enhance performance under stress conditions. The medical instructor continued, additionally, their healing factor is significantly faster than most coalition species, and you can see here that the micro tears in her muscle tissue are already being repaired, even as she continues fighting. In the ring, Sarah had begun to implement a strategy that made perfect sense once the observers understood her capabilities and she was targeting Catharin's legs with quick low kicks that individually did minimal damage, but cumulatively were compromising his base and stability. Each kick landed on the same spots, and over time, the repeated impacts were causing bruising even through Catharin's natural armor. And more importantly, they were forcing him to adjust his stance constantly, which burned more energy and increased his fatigue weatheron. Tried to counter with a grab, but Sarah slipped away and delivered 2 quick punches to his ribs that made him grunt, and the sound carried across the arena, and several recruits gasped because they had never heard a star warrior make a sound of discomfort in combat. Sarah's own face was a mess of bruises and swelling, and blood had dried on her chin from the split lip, and her uniform was torn in several places, but her eyes were clear and focused. And she moved with growing confidence. Same memory surfaced in her mind from years ago when she had run her first ultramarathon back on Earth, and the race director had explained the concept of persistence hunting to the assembled runners. Before the start, our ancestors didn't outrun their prey, he had said. They outlasted them, and they ran prey animals to exhaustion over distances that would kill most predators, and humans are the greatest endurance hunters this planet ever produced. Sarah had run that race and hit the wall at mile 50, where her body screamed at her to stop, and every step felt like torture, and she had kept running, and eventually her body had accepted that stopping wasn't an option and found reserves she didn't know existed. This trial was the same principle, and she had hit her wall around minute 8. When Catharin was dominating, and part of her brain had screamed that this was hopeless and she should quit, but humans didn't quit, and that was the secret that most of the galaxy didn't understand, because they saw human fragility and assumed weakness. And they didn't see the psychological resilience that allowed humans to ignore what their bodies told them. Breathing was now a harsh rasp that echoed through the arena, and his scales, which had gleamed at the start, were now dull, and his movements had slowed to the point where Sarah was landing strikes almost at will. She targeted his breathing with quick jabs to the solar plexus, and she kicked his legs to further compromise his mobility, and she circled constantly and made him turn and burn more energy just to keep her in his field of vision. The timer showed 25 minutes elapsed and 5 minutes remaining, and everyone in the arena knew that the outcome was no longer in doubt, because Catharin was running on fumes while Sarah looked like she could continue for another hour, if necessary. One of the human recruits in the observation deck was explaining to a confused alien classmate, "She's doing what humans do best, and she's refusing to quit, and her body is built for this kind of fight," another human added. "We evolved chasing antelope across the savannah in the African heat, and we would follow them for hours or days until they literally couldn't run anymore, and then we would walk up and kill them with rocks." The alien recruit looked horrified. "That is the most terrifying hunting strategy I have ever heard." "Exactly," the human replied with a grim smile. "And now you understand why humans are dangerous." On the mat, Catharin tried one more desperate attack, and he launched himself forward with the last of his strength in a final attempt to end the fight decisively. Sarah saw it coming and sidestepped, and Catharin's momentum carried him into the energy barrier, which crackled and repelled him back toward the center of the ring. He staggered and went down on one knee, and his chest heaved as he tried to draw enough breath to continue, and Sarah immediately backed off and gave him space, but maintained her guard position. The arena fell silent, except for Catharin's labored breathing, and everyone watched to see what would happen next, and whether the proud guitar warrior would continue or acknowledge what was becoming increasingly obvious. Sarah's voice cut through the silence, and her tone was respectful but firm. "Do you yield?" Catharin looked up at her, and his eyes showed something that Scar eyes rarely displayed in combat situations, and it was not fear exactly, but perhaps a dawning understanding of what it meant to be hunted rather than being the hunter. He looked to Instructor Wormash, and his expression asked a question that his pride wouldn't let him voice, and Wormash gave him a slow, respectful nod that granted permission to surrender with honor intact. "Yield," Catharin said, and his voice was rough with exhaustion, and perhaps a touch of something that might have been respect. Arena erupted in shocked conversation, and several recruits from warrior species looked disturbed by what they had witnessed. because the natural order had been inverted, and the physically superior combatant had been defeated by someone who should have been easy prey. Sarah relaxed her stance and immediately moved to Catharon to check on his condition, and she offered him a hand up, which he accepted after a moment's hesitation, and the gesture spoke volumes about human nature and their approach to combat. Medical teams rushed onto the mat and began scanning both combatants, and the medic assigned to Sarah tried to guide her to a treatment station, but she waved them off and insisted that Catharon needed attention first. "He fought harder than I did," Sarah said through swollen lips. "Make sure he's okay." Catharon heard this and looked at Sarah with new eyes and said, "You did not fight harder, but you fought longer, and I have never encountered such a thing." The timer hit 30 minutes, and the trial officially concluded, and Instructor Warmesh stood to address the assembled recruits, while Vexenal stood, frozen with his datapad and his earlier declaration of Sarah's failure hanging in the air like a bad smell. Instructor Warmesh descended from the observation platform with his forearms, moving in gestures that commanded attention, and silence fell across the arena as the senior instructor prepared to address what everyone had witnessed. Said Vixel felt shame burning through his body, and his three eyes couldn't meet anyone's gaze as he realized the magnitude of his error, and how his arrogance and preconceptions had nearly robbed Sarah Chen of the recognition I had earned through sheer determination. The Centauri evaluator had assumed he knew the outcome before the trial began, and he had projected his own biases onto the situation and declared failure when he should have been watching and learning and understanding. Around the ring, other recruits were having similar revelations, and those from warrior species were particularly affected because they had built their entire self-concept around physical dominance and superior combat capabilities to see one of the star brought to exhaustion and submission by someone smaller and weaker challenged fundamental assumptions about what made an effective warrior and what traits actually mattered in extended combat situations. "What you have witnessed today," Warmesh began, and his voice carried to every corner of the arena, "is a demonstration of why the Coalition accepted humanity. Despite their late technological development and apparent physical limitations," he gestured toward Sarah, who stood near Catharon, while medical scanners hummed. Over both of them, Recruit Chen did not win through superior strength or speed or natural weapons, and she won through endurance and adaptability and psychological resilience. Warmesh pulled up holographic displays that showed comparative data. From the trial at the 10-minute mark, most observers would have declared this fight over, and Catharon had dominated every exchange and landed significant damage and achieved multiple submission holds. The display shifted to show metabolic data and energy expenditure rates. But look at what was happening beneath the surface. And Catharon was burning through his energy reserves at an unsustainable rate, while Chen was pacing herself and managing her resources for the long engagement. Another instructor named Jacksim was a Quellan with multiple tentacles instead of limbs, added her observations. Humans evolved as persistence hunters on a death world classified as high danger by Coalition survey standards. Jacksim continued their homeworld of Earth required them to develop unique survival strategies, and they couldn't outrun most predators, and they couldn't overpower most prey animals, so they developed the ability to simply outlast everything else on their planet. The holographic display now showed footage from Earth and ancient humans chasing animals across vast open plains under a burning sun, and the prey would sprint away, and then the humans would follow at a steady jog, and the prey would sprint again, and the humans would follow. This pattern repeated for hours and then days, and eventually the prey animal would collapse from heat exhaustion and dehydration, while the humans remained functional because their bodies were optimized for exactly this kind of pursuit. Efficient bipedal locomotion, Jacksim listed, while highlighting relevant anatomical features. Advanced thermoregulation through eccrine sweating glands, as distributed across their entire body surface, and rapid injury recovery through enhanced healing factors, SRATH. Added medical perspective, psychological resilience that allows them to suppress survival instincts and continue functioning despite pain and exhaustion that would incapacitate most species, and the ability to override their body's demands to stop or mesh. Let this information settle and watch the faces of recruits as they process the implications these traits allowed humans to become the apex predator on Earth not through physical dominance but through sheer refusal to quit Sarah. Listened to this analysis and felt strange hearing her species described in such clinical terms, but she also felt pride because the instructors were finally understanding. What humans brought to the coalition Thuron had recovered enough to speak. And he addressed the gathered crowd. I have fought many opponents from many species, and I have always known that I would prevail through strength and skill and natural superiority. His scales rippled in patterns that indicated deep thought, but today I learned what it means to be prey, and this human did not overpower me, but she exhausted me, and I have never felt such a thing, and it is humbling. Other star recruits looked uncomfortable because their entire culture was built around individual combat prowess, and the idea that superior strength could be defeated by superior endurance challenged core beliefs for Mesh. Addressed this directly, many species in the coalition have optimized for dueling or arena combat or short decisive engagements, and this makes sense because most of our conflicts in recent generations have been resolved through negotiation or limited military actions. He paused and his expression grew serious. But this is changing, and we have reports from the frontier of a new threat and an enemy that does not duel or negotiate or accept defeat, and they simply keep coming. The mood in the arena shifted as recruits realized this trial had implications beyond simple combat certification and war mesh. Continued, we need warriors who understand that survival is not about winning individual exchanges, but about refusing to lose the overall engagement. Sarah felt a chill despite the heat and sweat because she understood where this was going and why the instructors had designed this trial the way they had. Chin Warmesh said formally, "You are hereby promoted to Advanced Combat Program with full honors, and you are also assigned as training consultant to help develop new doctrines." Sarah straightened despite her exhaustion and injuries. "Yes, sir. And what kind of doctrine?" "Endurance warfare," Warmesh replied. "You will teach other species the human approach to extended combat and how to manage resources and maintain psychological resilience and fight beyond the point where every instinct says to quit." Vexenol finally found his voice and stepped forward with his datapad held loosely in Instructor Warmesh, "And I must apologize for my earlier statement, and I allowed prejudice to cloud my judgment, and I declared Recruit Chen failed when she was demonstrating exactly the qualities this trial was meant to test." Warmesh regarded Vexenol with an expression that was stern but not entirely unsympathetic. "Your error was significant, but also instructive, and you assumed you knew the outcome before the data was complete, and this is a common failing among evaluators." The senior instructor addressed everyone. "Let this be a lesson about assumptions and preconceptions, and never declare something impossible simply because it conflicts with your expectations." Sarah approached Catharin and offered a respectful salute in the star style, which involved pressing her fist to her chest. "You fought with great honor, and I learned much from facing you." Catherine returned the salute and added, "You have taught me that honor in combat is not only about strength, but also about endurance, and I will not forget this lesson." The medical team finally insisted on treating both combatants, and as Sarah was led away for proper medical attention, she heard the other human recruits cheering and celebrating, because one of their own had proven that humans belonged in combat roles, but she also noticed the concerned expressions on the instructors' faces when they thought no one was watching, and she wondered about this new threat from the frontier and what it would take to fight an enemy that never stopped. In the medical bay, the doctor was a krill named Vatron who scanned Sarah's injuries. "With professional efficiency, you have multiple contusions and several cracked ribs and extensive soft tissue damage, and yet you continued fighting." "That's what humans do," Sarah said simply. "We keep going." Vatron made a sound that might have been approval. "Your species is either very brave or very foolish, and I've not decided which. Probably both," Sarah admitted with a painful smile as the medical scanners worked their repair protocols. Sarah thought about what Warmesh had said regarding the frontier threat and an enemy that never stopped, and she wondered if the galaxy was about to learn what happened when an unstoppable force met an immovable objector. In this case, what happened when an enemy that never quit encountered a species that had evolved to outlast everything. 3 days after the trial, Sarah Chen stood in a secure briefing room deep within Station Vex 7, and her injuries had healed remarkably fast, thanks to both human biology and coalition medical technology working together. The bruises that had covered her face were now faded to pale yellow, and the cracked ribs had been reinforced with cellular regeneration treatments, and she moved without the stiffness that had plagued her. Immediately after, the fight instructor Warmesh sat across from her at a holographic display table, and the room's security protocols ensured complete privacy for what they were about to discuss. "I want to show you something," Warmesh said, and activated the holographic projector. Images appeared in the air between them, showing star systems along the outer rim of Coalition space, and many of the systems were marked with red indicators that Sarah didn't recognize but assumed meant something bad. "This is the frontier," Warmesh explained, "and these red markers indicate systems where we have lost contact with Coalition outposts or civilian installations over the past 8 months. Sarah leaned forward and studied the pattern. "That's a lot of Red 17 systems," Warmesh confirmed, "and we initially assumed it was equipment failure or natural disasters or simple communication problems because the frontier is vast and sometimes things go wrong." He manipulated the display and brought up recordings from automated monitoring stations, but then we started receiving fragmentary transmissions before the stations went dark. The first recording played and showed a Quellan officer at a frontier outpost looking off-screen with increasing alarm, and her tentacles writhed in agitation as she spoke rapidly into a communicator. "They're not stopping." The officer said, "We've hit them with everything, and they just keep coming, and there are too many and request immediate evacuation for all personnel." The transmission cut to static, and Warmesh brought up another recording from a different system showing a Vronak's military commander with similar desperation in his voice. "Fall back to secondary positions." The commander ordered, "Conserve ammunition and establish overlapping fields of fire." "And they don't retreat, so we have to make every shot count." More static, and then silence as the system went dark, like all the other Sierra. Felt cold, despite the climate-controlled room. "What are they fighting?" Warmesh brought up the clearest image they had managed to capture, and it showed creatures that looked vaguely insectoid with multiple limbs and armored carapaces and features that suggested they had evolved for one purpose only. "We call them the Endless," Warmesh said, "because that's how survivors describe them, and they attack in massive swarms, and they don't communicate, and they don't negotiate, and they don't stop." The hologram showed combat footage from the last moments of a Coalition defense station, and Sarah watched as waves of these creatures threw themselves at fortified positions without regard for casualties. They died by the hundreds, but more kept coming, and when defensive positions were overrun, the Endless moved on to the next target, and then the next, and they never paused and never regrouped and never showed any behavior except relentless forward assault. "They're like army ants on Earth," Sarah observed. "They don't think or plan, they just consume everything in their path." An apt comparison, Warmesh agreed, and it presents a problem for Coalition military doctrine, which is built around the assumption that enemies will behave rationally, respond to deterrence, and negotiate when losses become unsustainable. He brought up tactical analyses, showing Coalition forces engaging the Endless. "Our warriors are trained for decisive combat and short engagements and establishing dominance quickly and efficiently." Sarah saw the pattern immediately, but the Endless don't care about dominance, and they don't recognize defeat, and they just keep attacking until either they're all dead or we are. "Exactly," Warmesh said with grim satisfaction. "And this is why your trial was designed the way it was, and we need soldiers who can fight like the Endless, but with intelligence and strategy and human adaptability." Sarah understood now why the instructors had watched her trial with such intensity. "You need persistence hunters who can keep fighting when everyone else is exhausted." Warmesh nodded his large head. "The Coalition has been at peace for too long, and we have forgotten what extended warfare requires, and our species have optimized for qualities that matter in peacetime, but may not serve us against an enemy like this." He pulled up recruitment data and training protocols. "We are redesigning our combat doctrine around human principles of endurance warfare, and we need instructors who can teach other species how to fight beyond their comfort zones." Sarah looked at the data and saw that every human recruit at the academy was being flagged for advanced combat training. "You want us to teach the galaxy how to refuse to quit?" "Yes," Warmesh said simply. "And you will start with the species who pride themselves on being warriors because they need to learn this the most over the next weeks. Sarah found herself leading training sessions for recruits from the Star and Vonax and Keller species who had built their entire cultures around combat prowess. An individual strength Theron was among the first to volunteer for the new training program, and he approached Sarah after the first session with thoughtful respect. "You are teaching us to fight like prey animals, and it feels wrong, but I understand why it is necessary. It's not about fighting like prey," Sarah explained. "It's about understanding that the fight doesn't end when you get knocked down, and it ends when you can't get back up." She ran them through endurance drills that would have been routine for human soldiers but were torture for species. It's not evolved for sustained effort, and many quit the first day and more quit the second. Those who stayed began to change, and they learned to pace themselves and manage their energy and fight through pain and exhaustion that their instincts screamed was unbearable. Sarah stood with Warmesh, watching a training session where Catharin was sparring with another Star in an extended engagement. "He's learning, they all are," Warmesh agreed, "but it goes against everything their evolution tells them, and this is harder than any physical training." A group of human recruits jogged past on a long distance run, and several alien recruits had joined them and were struggling to maintain the pace but refusing to quit. "We're changing the culture of coalition military," Sarah observed, "and I'm not sure everyone is happy about it." "Change is never comfortable," Warmesh replied, "but it is necessary, and the Endless are coming, and we must be ready." 3 months after her trial, Sarah stood in another briefing room with senior coalition command staff, and they were reviewing deployment plans for frontier defense forces. "We're implementing human endurance doctrine across all combat units," a Krill admiral explained while showing force disposition charts. "And early results from field exercises are promising." Another officer added, "Morale is mixed, and warrior species are struggling with the psychological aspects, but performance metrics show improvement in sustained combat scenarios." Sarah listened to discussions about her species, approach to warfare being adopted across the galaxy, and it felt surreal but also inevitable, because humanity had something the Coalition needed after the briefing. Warmesh walked with Sarah through the station corridors. "You have done well, and your training programs are being adopted at every military academy in Coalition space. It's strange to think that the thing we're best at is refusing to lose." Sarah sighed. Vormsh made a sound that was the Krill equivalent of laughter. "Every species is best at something, and humans are best at endurance and psychological resilience and the stubborn refusal to accept defeat." They reached an observation deck overlooking the training grounds where hundreds of recruits from dozens of species were running endurance drills and practicing sustained combat techniques. "The Endless are still coming," Warmesh said quietly. "Our scouts report they are only months away from core Coalition territory." Sarah watched the recruits training below and thought about what was coming in an enemy that never stopped facing defenders who were learning not to stop either. When they arrive, she said, they're going to learn what happens when an irresistible force meets an immovable object, or when an enemy that never quits encounters a species that evolved to outlast everything. Warmesh added. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "We've been persistence hunters for millions of years, and we chased prey across continents until it collapsed from exhaustion, and now the galaxy is about to see what that really means." Far below, another group of recruits started a long-distance run, and among them were Scar and Vronax and Quellen, and humans all running together and learning to fight together and understanding that victory sometimes meant simply lasting longer than the enemy. Endless were coming, and they would bring their relentless assault and their overwhelming numbers and their complete disregard for casualties, but they would face something they had never encountered before, in humans who refused to quit, and a coalition that had learned from humanity's greatest strengths. Chen looked out at the stars where somewhere in the darkness an enemy approached, and she thought about her ancestors on the African plains, who had brought down animals 10 times their size through sheer endurance. "Welcome to humanity's war," she whispered. "To the approaching darkness, you're about to learn what it means when prey evolves into the predator."